Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here today at this very important event. My name is Aya, and I'm the president for Student Justice in Palestine. On behalf of all students who are a part of Student Justice in Palestine at UWM, we welcome you to this event and hope that you find it to be beneficial and insightful. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge a disturbing reality that we have faced for the past hours and days. We have received multiple threats from pro-Israeli extremist groups online and on various social media platforms. These are clear attempts to silence the event and to intimidate us, and to prevent a scholar from speaking on a topic that goes against the narrative that many try to push. But why? But why try to silence us? Why are they so afraid to why are they so afraid of an open academic discussion on current events? The answer is simple: because truth is power. And tonight, despite the many efforts and threats to shut down this event, we are proud to stand here today, and we will not be silenced. As we gather, we recognize that this conversation is not just about theory or history. It is about the urgent and ongoing struggle for justice and for free speech and for the right to name and resist genocide, particularly in Gaza. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and express our gratitude to our community sponsors, Islamic Society of Milwaukee, Muslim Women's Coalition, and Wisconsin Muslim Civic Alliance. Their support has been invaluable in making this event possible. Over the past year, we have witnessed an alarming crackdown on free speech and free assembly, particularly on campuses across the country. The repression we face today echoes past struggles from the free speech movement in Berkeley in the 1960s, led by Mario Savio, to the civil rights and anti-war movements. These movements challenged power, exposed injustice, and insisted on the right to speak the truth when those in power sought to silence it. And that brings us to today's guest, Dr. Norman Finkelstein. He is no stranger to speaking the truth in the face of repression. It is a great privilege to welcome Dr. Finkelstein, a scholar whose work has challenged the mainstream narrative on the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and because of that, he has made him a target of relentless attacks. Dr. Finkelstein is a son of Holocaust survivors. His parents endured the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps, and their experiences shaped his unwavering commitment to the truth and justice. He has spent decades researching history and the conflict, writing extensively on the misuse of the Holocaust memory to justify Israel policies, and exposing the power structures that suppress dissent. But for speaking truth to power, Dr. Finkelstein has paid a heavy price. He has been ostracized by many in the American Jewish community, blacklisted from academia, and marginalized in a public discourse, not because his scholarship is flawed, but because his conclusions challenge the status quo built on historical distortion and political convenience. We are here at a university, a place that should stand for free speech, critical thinking, and for an open exchange of ideas. If we cannot discuss the reality of Israeli occupation and the systematic oppression of Palestinians here, then where can we? If an academic of Dr. Finkelstein caliber can be silenced for his work, what does that say about the integrity of our institutions? The threats we have faced prove exactly why this conversation is necessary. The attempt to shut down this event only confirms the urgency for Dr. Finkelstein's work. We refuse to be intimidated. We refuse to let fear dictate what we can and cannot be said on our campuses. And today we are grateful to hear from him directly. Before we begin, we want to establish a few ground rules to ensure that this event runs smoothly and that everyone has the opportunity to listen and engage respectfully. During Dr. Finkelstein's talk, we ask that there are no interruptions or side conversations. Please remain quiet and allow him to speak without disruption. During the Q&A session, we encourage thoughtful and engaging questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and someone with a microphone will come to you and you will have the opportunity to engage with Dr. Finkelstein. We may not get to everyone if there is not time. Depending, we, we welcome back and forth discussion during the Q&A only if you have the microphone. But any disruptions, including talking at a turn, interrupting, or anything beyond that, will result in the removal of you from the event. SJP, UWM staff, and UWM reserve the right to remove anyone who fails to follow these rules. If you are asked to leave, you will be given one warning, and if you refuse, you will be escorted out by UWM PD. If there are any disruptions, we ask that all audience members do not engage. Dr. Finkelstein is more than capable of handling any challenges. We do not want audience members responding to disruptors or getting involved in confrontations. Please let volunteers and staff handle it safely and quickly to remove the disruptor. We hope for a successful and smooth event, and we appreciate your cooperation in ensuring a respectful and safe discussion. With that, it's finally time to get started. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Finkelstein.
Okay, that was quite a reception for you, Professor Finkelstein. Thank you, Aya, for introducing this event. And I just want to mention a couple of things before we begin. Firstly, we've requested the police be here to ensure the safety of the attendees, volunteers, staff, and of course, Professor Finkelstein. So don't be intimidated by their presence. We are requesting them to be here. And yeah, I know there's a lot of them, but again, we're requesting that the police be here. Secondly, we're just gonna wait for this to check. Okay, perfect. Okay. Secondly, SJP has been working on this event for a couple months now. And in the process of putting this event together and publicizing it, UW-Milwaukee's administration has launched three, not one, not two, three separate investigations into SJP that are still ongoing. And that just highlights the repression that we've been facing here on campus, specifically the repression of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students. And I just want to point that out. But regardless, we are still here. We're still doing the event. We're happy to have Professor Finkelstein joining us. So thank you, everyone, for coming out today. And thank you. Okay, without further ado, let's begin. So let's talk about the ceasefire in Gaza. As we all know, a three-phase ceasefire agreement took effect on January 19th, beginning with a 6-week ceasefire and the exchange of all Israelis held in Gaza for some of the Palestinians held in Israel. What do you make of the structure of the ceasefire deal, the 3 phases, and why is it that a deal drafted in May of 2024 was accepted just a couple weeks ago?
Like most questions in general, but in particular pertaining to the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's important to be knowledgeable about the factual historical record, not just the present, but the past. Now, there are actually a majority of older people in the audience, but for the sake of the younger people in the audience, I just have to go back a bit. Beginning in 2008-9, Israel conducted what it called operations in Gaza of a very significant magnitude. They call them not just operations, but they call them mowings of the lawn in Gaza. And the best known ones are Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, began December 26, 2008, and it ended January 17th, 2009. That's not a trivial fact. It ended 3 days before Barack Obama was inaugurated president, and Obama, being a stupefying narcissist, didn't want any distraction from his inauguration. So he gave the order to the Israeli government at the time, it was Ehud Olmert, to end Operation Cast Lead. After Cast Lead, there was an agreement of sorts, and the agreement had two aspects: the ceasefire and lifting or easing the brutal, criminal, medieval blockade of Gaza that began, or its most intensive phase began, in January 2006, when Hamas won the parliamentary elections and, in effect, became the government. The ceasefire happened. The lifting of the blockade did not. In 2012, there was Operation Pillar of Defense. It lasted a shorter period of time. It lasted only a week. And that too ended with a ceasefire, and it was supposed to end with an easing or lifting of the blockade. When the agreement came before the Israeli government, at that time, Ehud Barak was the defense minister. And he said, once the ceasefire is signed, everything else in the agreement everything else in the agreement, apart from the ceasefire, will be forgotten. That means the part about lifting the blockade or easing the blockade of Gaza. Same thing happened during Operation Protective Edge, July-August 2014. It was 51 days. It ended August 26th. I think it started July 7th, if my memory is right. Again, there was the ceasefire and then the promise to ease or lift the blockade of Gaza. The first happened, the second didn't. I should also add, on May 31st, 2010, there was a humanitarian flotilla en route to Gaza carrying humanitarian materials, cement, because Israel at that point was not allowing cement into Gaza. It came under Israeli attack, the flotilla. The Israeli commandos killed 9 passengers aboard the flagship vessel, the Mavi Marmara. A 10th died later. After the Mavi Marmara incident, it evoked the international furor. After it, there was the promise to ease the blockade of Gaza. Never happened. So now we come to the present. There's this 3-stage, as it's called, agreement. As some of you will know, stages 2 and 3, they're not even part of the public record. Just stage 1 has been published. Judging from the record, we can say the following things. Number 1, why was it signed now? There, the answer is perfectly obvious, in my opinion, though many people disagree. To my thinking, it's obvious. Namely, a month before President Trump was inaugurated, he said all hell would break out if the hostages weren't released. Well, he had two problems. It was a bit late in the day to threaten all hell because all hell had broken out under President Biden. There was not much left hell to inflict on Gaza. Number two, as everybody knows, the Israeli genocide in Gaza gradually became unpopular even in the United States. And so President Trump didn't want to begin his term of office like a monster because he recognized he's not a genius politician, but it doesn't require one to understand he doesn't want the Gaza albatross on his watch. So he's not going to unleash even more firepower on the defenseless refugee child population. On the other hand, he doesn't want to come across like a blowhard. He threatened all hell would break loose if the hostages weren't released. And so he basically conveyed to Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have to release the hostages. Or I should say, you have to have a hostage exchange for the Palestinians being held hostage. You have to have a hostage exchange. But the rest, like Ehud Barak said after Operation Pillar of Defense, it'll all be forgotten. In my opinion, probably the whole hostage aspect, as in hostage for hostage, that will be played out. The rest clearly will never be played out. Israel did not spend 16 months to reduce Gaza to rubble to suddenly decide, along with John Lennon in my generation, let's give peace a chance and rebuild Gaza. That's not plausible. That's not credible. That's not believable. So that first phase, the ceasefire and hostage for hostage, will be carried out. The rest, one has to be honest about these things. We're all adults in this room, and part of respecting people is not to paint rosy pictures. We have to have a firm handle on reality as we figure out how to go forward. And right now, I think everybody in this room knows the picture is very grim. It's not grim because of what President Trump pronounced a couple of days ago, that he's going to build a golf course and a casino in Gaza. That's not the grim part. The grim part is a physical reality. The physical reality is Gaza is no more. The last UN statistics I looked at from a couple of weeks ago said that, number one, 92% of the homes in Gaza have either been destroyed or seriously undermined. What's the word? Seriously
Damaged.
damaged. 92%. There's 50 million tons of rubble in Gaza. I want to give you a sense of what 50 million tons means. I mentioned earlier Operation Cast Lead. For those old enough to remember 2008-9, when Operation Cast Lead happened, it was a horror on a scale not seen before. And I wrote a little book on the topic, and I took the title from an Israeli journalist named Gideon Levy, and the title was, "This Time We Went Too Far." And For those who remember those days, there was huge outrage at Operation Cast Lead. Well, at the end of Operation Cast Lead, the estimates were there were 600,000 tons of rubble. So put that number in your head, 600,000 tons of rubble. Operation Protective Edge in 2014, July, August 2014, Operation Protective Edge, it was such a monstrosity that the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, his name was Peter Maurer, and his job description was basically just to tour war zones. He came to Gaza after 2014, and he said, and I'm quoting him now, "In all my professional life, I've never seen the level of destruction that I saw in Gaza." At the end of Operation Protective Edge, the estimate was 2.5 million tons of rubble. And in fact, by 2023, Gaza hadn't even rebuilt from Operation Protective Edge. So we had 600,000 tons of rubble. This time we went too far. We had 5 million tons of rubble. I've never seen destruction like this ever before. And now we come to Gaza 16 months later. You know what the figure for the rubble is? 50 million tons. 50 million tons. The best estimates are if Israel were to allow in 100 trucks a day, which will never happen, if it were to allow in 100 trucks a day, it would take 15 years just to clear out the rubble. The rubble is mixed in with unexploded ordnance and toxic substances. So it's hard. I won't start going through the question of the infrastructure that was destroyed, the waste, sanitation, electricity, all of it was systematically destroyed. The biggest misnomer, the biggest misapprehension about Gaza in the past 16 months, the biggest falsehood about Gaza the past 16 months is that it was a war with Hamas. It wasn't a war, and it wasn't with Hamas. Hamas was just a sideshow. The goal was, and the Israelis made it absolutely clear, one of the interesting aspects of this past 16 months is there was a large number of compilations of just statements by Israeli, from the senior officials down to the lowest level, across the political spectrum, and including every aspect, division of civil life in Israel. And what comes across with a kind of mind-numbing detail is the goal was to destroy Gaza. It had nothing to do with Hamas. Hamas was a sideshow. Israel was determined, as I said earlier, they used to call their operations mowings of the lawn. And this time around, they decided we're not mowing the lawn anymore. We're going to extirpate, that's the fancy word for pull out by the roots. We're going to extirpate every blade of grass in Gaza. And they were going to do it basically 3 ways, but each of the modus operandi, they overlapped. 1, we're going to try a mass ethnic cleansing. And at the time, Some of you might recall Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, went to Egypt and tried to convince the head of state to accept the mass expulsion into the Sinai. Blinken said no, and so the mass ethnic cleansing was put on hold. It's not true that it was totally unsuccessful. Depending on who you read, between 100 and 200,000 people in Gaza have left in the past 15 months. I read the figure this morning of 100,000, but I've seen other figures saying closer to 200,000. But on the whole, it was unsuccessful. The second method was just an outright genocide, just an outright mass killing. And that too, by any comparative reckoning, was remarkably successful. If you look at standard indices, number of civilians to combatants killed, number of children to total number killed, number of women and children versus adult males killed. If you look at all the standard indices, number of journalists killed, number of medics killed, number of UN workers killed, by every measure, Gaza is in a class so completely its own. I'll give you one example. In the first 3 weeks of October, October 7th to October 31st, the estimate is 1,900 children were killed. So fix that number in your mind, 1,900. Most everybody will agree that Assad's regime in Syria was a very brutal regime. I don't think there's, his first name slipped my mind.
Bashar
Bashar.
al-Assad.
I remember his father. So it was a brutal regime. I think it's silly, pointless, and embarrassing to argue otherwise. And the most brutal year of his regime was said to be 2016. You know how many children were killed in the worst month of 2016 in Syria? 279. In the worst month, Gaza, in 3 weeks, 1,900. Actually, in the worst year in Syria, the year 2016, the total number of children killed under that brutal dictatorship of Bashar Assad, roughly the same number, 1,900 and something, were killed in 1 year as in Gaza in 3 weeks. And so the genocide phase, by any comparative reckoning, was quite successful in Gaza. But the overarching goal was very simple. We're simply going to make Gaza uninhabitable, and then the people will have to leave. Now, you might say I'm Monday morning quarterbacking in light of what the statements have been made in the past week or so. I said it from day one. It was, if you look, I did 1,000 interviews, and you will see in every one I said the goal was to make Gaza uninhabitable, so as to say the population has to leave. There's nothing to go back to. And that's exactly what they achieved their goal. I don't want to engage in an open quarrel now because we need solidarity. But I find it silly beyond words when people say Israel lost the war in Gaza, Hamas won the war in Gaza. There was no war in Gaza. There was a genocide in Gaza. It targeted the civilian population, and its goal was to once and for all to solve the Gaza question. And an honest reckoning, in my opinion, would have to say they achieved their goal. Now, how it's going to be resolved from here on in, I can't say. I do think there's an element of unrealism to imagine that the people of Gaza are somehow made of stone, that they won't make, that they will insist on staying, and they won't make the decision, you know what, there's nothing to go back to. And there won't be anything to go back to for maybe 15 years. Bear in mind, it would take 15 years to clear away the rubble. We're not even talking about reconstruction. So I can't predict what's going to happen, but I think we have to be realistic about what did happen. And of those 3 stages in the ceasefire agreement, I find it wholly implausible that it's going to go beyond hostage for hostage, so President Trump can boast that his threat to let loose hell on Gaza was, it filled the people of Hamas with dread and they agreed to the hostage exchange. But beyond that, does anyone seriously believe that President Trump is going to insist that the Israelis allow in humanitarian aid? That doesn't sound very plausible. Does anyone believe that President Trump is going to insist that the Israelis allow for the reconstruction in Gaza with the people remaining? That doesn't sound very plausible. So it's a very grim picture. And how to go forward, on that aspect, I am unclear. But there are other things that need to be done. And when the question is asked of me, I will speculate on how we should go forward here, not there, here.
And as a frame of reference, I think you've perfectly illustrated the level of destruction, 50 million rebels. And just to let everyone know, some parts of the ceasefire agreement that have been publicized have said that a timeline of 3 to 5 years of rebuilding Gaza is what they're going to put in place. Even Trump's Middle East special envoy called this preposterous. And just as a frame of reference, that new chemistry building on campus took 6 years to design and build. And they want to allow 3 to 5 years worth of reconstruction in Gaza to rebuild the entirety of the Gaza Strip. How do you think they came up with that number? I mean, this is absurd. Is it something they threw in there?
When you follow the conflict closely, you discover that all the numbers are completely made up. Every number is just pulled from thin air. It's so laughable. I'll just give you a few examples to illustrate the point. The New York Times, which is the main Israeli newspaper in the United States, the New York Times reports things like there are 450 miles of tunnels in Gaza. 450 miles. And they say, our sources, our secret sources, there's this Israeli intelligence agent who masquerades as a reporter for the Times named Ronan Bergman. And he says, according to my sources, yeah, what's his sources? The sources is the Mossad. They want to feed disinformation to the United States. They throw numbers at him. 450 miles of tunnels. So I was curious about that number. Where did they come up with it? How many people have been to New York City in this room? Raise your hand. Oh, fine. How many people have rode the subway system? Good. So, you know, it's a pretty complex, rarefied subway system. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A line, B line, C line, D line, all the way to Z, some letters missed. It's a very complex system. So I did a little research the way young people do now. I go on the web. I decided to be a moron for a day. And I looked up how many miles are in the New York City subway system. 430. So you're telling me that there were more miles of subway, of tunnels. I say 430 miles of tunnels. 430 miles of tunnels in the New York City subway system. So you're telling me there are more tunnels in Gaza than there are in my New York City subway system? No, that's not really believable. That's not really believable. I checked with some civil engineers in Gaza, and they said it's complete nonsense. Even Sinwar, who was given to, the late Mr. Sinwar, who was given to boasting, that's part of the psychological game, I get it. He said 300 miles of tunnels, but Israel says 430. Why they 450? Why do they say 450? Because then it justifies destroying all of Gaza. You can always say we're targeting tunnels. So it pulls the number out of thin air. Then the figure for the number of Hamas combatants killed. How could you possibly know that number? First of all, the Israeli Gaza Ministry of Health says we don't know the number. And they deal with the dead bodies. It's not as if members of Hamas walk around with an ID card that says terrorist. No. How would they know? Everything is obliterated. Before the Israeli, the IDF as it's called, before it takes one step, it obliterates everything in front of it. How would they know how many Hamas militants are buried there? If you follow the numbers as I do, you know what the number always is? It's very simple. Whatever is the total figure for the number of Gazans who are estimated to have been killed, Israel will say the number of combatants killed is in a proportion of either 1 or 1.5 to 2. So let's say if the official number of Gazans killed is 40,000, Israel will say 18,000 were Hamas terrorists. Why did they do that? Because they want to say this is the cleanest war ever fought. That the ratio is usually 1 to 6, one combatant for 6 civilians or one combatant for 9 civilians. So they'll say in Gaza it's 1 or 1.5 to 2. So they simply calculate the number of combatants to show that this is the cleanest war ever fought in the history of humankind. All the numbers are just completely made up when you look at them closely, or if you have any sense of what's going on there. Ironically, and it is ironically, I think, the Israelis and their propagandists said the Gaza Ministry of Health was exaggerating the number of people killed. And along comes an article in Lancet, the most respected medical journal in the world. It's a British medical journal. And they said, yes, it's true. The Gaza Ministry of Health was exaggerating downward, that the number of people in Gaza killed was probably about 40% more than the Gaza Ministry of Health was saying. So, yes, it was exaggerated, as the Israelis say, but it was exaggerated downward, not upward.
So I'd like to bring up the topic of Arab governments. Not a particularly popular topic in this room, I presume, but um, Arab governments have largely remained passive spectators, as Gaza has been reduced to rubble, despite their immense wealth and influence. While some have made symbolic gestures or pledged aid, many continue to normalize ties with Israel or avoid direct confrontation. So, what role should the Arab governments play in, let's say, rebuilding Gaza or relieving the population of Gaza from this destruction and sorrow?
I'm not going to talk to the should, because there the answer is obvious. I want to talk about what the historical record shows. There was a period when the Palestine cause had immense, not material power, obviously, didn't have an army or economic wealth, but it had something else, and it's an interesting fact. It had uh, quite significant symbolic power, which is to say, Arab governments genuinely feared the Palestinian cause. So if you take one example, which I'm familiar with because I've studied the historical record, uh, Jimmy Carter recently passed. He was an extremely smart guy. And in his own way, he was an honorable guy. But he was an awful president. And he was the one that negotiated the Israel Egypt agreement beginning in 1977 and climaxing in 1979. And it was very impressive to read the historical record. He just knew exactly what to do. He was very systematic, very methodical, and he had a terrifying grasp of detail. I mean, it would take your breath away to read, because we have the original documents, and how he makes these marginal comments. You know, when his advisors present to him some agreement to read or pertaining to Israel Palestine, and you read his marginal comments and the level of micro detail that he had mastered was totally breathtaking. In any event, when he comes into office, he's determined he's going to solve the whole Israel-Palestine conflict. He then realizes that the Israelis are too dug in their heels. You can't do it. The only thing the Israelis were willing to do was to sign an agreement with Egypt. And the reason was very simple. It'll be a big surprise among young people, but Egypt was the powerhouse of the Arab world up until this Camp David agreement that was negotiated by President Carter or through President Carter. And the foreign minister at the time, who was also prominent in the military establishment, was a fellow named Moshe Dayan. And Dayan famously said, if you remove one wheel from a car, the car is stuck. It can't move. And so he said, if we remove the Egyptian wheel from the Arab front, they can't make war anymore. because Egypt was the powerhouse. If we remove the Egyptian will, so Israel didn't want another war like 1973, which was a pretty big catastrophe for them in many ways. The estimates are between 2,000 and 3,000 Israeli combatants were killed. And for a while, it looked like Israel was going to disappear. Turned out to be inflated, that fear, but it was actually believed. So they wanted to make the Arab world impotent, and the way they thought to do it was to remove the Egyptian wheel from the car. So Israel was willing to sign an agreement with Egypt, but no more. Whereas the Arab world wanted to just solve the problem. That is, a two-state settlement. According to international law, the Palestinians have the right to self-determination and statehood in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, and so forth. So why do I bring all this up? I bring it up because Jimmy Carter, being very systematic and methodical, he tours the whole Arab world. He goes to the Saudis, of course. And he says, if there's an agreement between Egypt and Israel, will you support it? The Saudis say, nope, we can't do anything unless you give the Palestinians a state. Now remember, Palestine, they have no material power. They have no military power, but they have this tremendous symbolic power in the Arab world. The Arab head of state says, we cannot agree to a deal that doesn't give the Palestinians a state. And Sadat, as you can imagine, he's panicking because if he can't get any support from the Arab world for this agreement, then it's going to make him look like a traitor. And you know what happens to traitors? They get shot. And so in many ways, Jimmy Carter was responsible for Sadat's assassination because he insisted on the deal in the absence of any Arab support. Now, I want to be clear, Sadat wanted the deal too, for sure, because the country was going through food riots, it was very unstable, and he just wanted the American money. He just wanted the American money. He wanted to join the American alliance. He basically, if you read the record, he said to Carter, you do whatever you want and I'll agree with you. Whatever you want, you just do it and I'll sign. And so he was, Jimmy Carter was Egypt's negotiator. So that's no longer true. Palestine doesn't have symbolic value the way it once did in the Arab world. And the question is why? I think the obvious answer is because since that era, there have been so many catastrophes in the Arab world. There's been Iraq, there's been Libya, there's been there's been Syria, and on, that the horror of the situation among the Palestinians began to pale in the face of now the inward-looking countries of the Arab world faced with all of their own domestic calamities and catastrophes. I'm not making an apology. I'm simply stating the facts. There were about 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. That's the total population of Gaza, these numbers. And these are the catastrophes that have befallen the Arab world. Having said that, the fact remains, and it is a fact, apart from the Houthis in Yemen and the Hezbollah in um, Lebanon, the Arab world abandoned the people of Gaza. They abandoned them. In fact, if we're honest about it, and I know I'll probably get some disagreement, and you're free to disagree, so did the West Bank. If you look at the various operations I mentioned, there was very little support in the West Bank for the people of Gaza. Very little. During the Great March of Return in March 2018, there was no support, none, in the West Bank for the nonviolent civil resistance in Gaza. The fact of the matter is, if you put aside the Houthis in Yemen and the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the biggest support for Gaza, and it's tremendously moving in its own way. You know where it came from? South Africa. South Africa was so tenacious. What does the word tenacious mean? Anyone know? What? Persistent. They were so tenacious. Most of you know some of the record, but you don't know all of the record. So as you know, they wrote, and they submitted on December 29th, 2023, what they called an application to the ICJ, International Court of Justice, charging that Israel was in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. Their application was 84 pages. It was single-spaced. It had over 500 footnotes. And for each footnote, there were like 3 references. It was a huge amount of work. Huge amount of work. Israel ignored what the ICJ ruled in January. I won't go through the record now. If you ask me later, I'm happy to. They go before the court again in February. They submit a new compilation of documentation. The court says Israel has to do what it was ordered to do in January. It repeats that. Israel ignores. South Africa goes before them again in March. Another thick compilation of facts, statistics, references, and so forth. And then guess what? It goes before them again in May. It keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. And then, for those of you who are interested, if you go to, it's called Letter to the Security Council, Letter to the Security Council, May 29th, 2024. They give up on the ICJ because Israel is ignoring it, and they now go to the Security Council. And they say, Israel is ignoring what the ICJ said, you have to act. And they submit a compilation, it's 121 pages, and it is so meticulously documented. I mean, it's just a breathtaking amount of work and investment. And now the case itself is before the court, and hold your breath. They submitted a 750-page, what's called memorial, with 4,000 pages of supplementary documentation. 750 pages with 4,000 pages of supplementary documentation. Now you ask yourself, what did the rest of the Arab world do? I think the silence answers the question, as in nothing. I don't blame the people. I'm sure their hearts go out. Why did the Houthis, why are they so adamant? You know why? Because what was done to Gaza was done to them. The Saudi blockade, which I think killed in 2 years, I don't remember the exact number, but something like 80,000 people died from starvation because of those Saudi monsters. So they know what was done, what's being done to Gaza was done to them. And the Hezbollah, people want to say it's manipulated by Iran. And yeah, there was, you can't deny the fact that Iran is a factor. But my own estimate, I'm not going to argue with people because I know people from Syria have very sincere, legitimate grievances against the Hezbollah, and I'm not going to quarrel with that. But I think on the whole, Hassan Nasrallah, Sayed Nasrallah was an extremely intelligent, honorable, and dignified figure. And I think his death left a huge void in the Arab world. He was a new voice. He was a new voice in the Arab world. He carried, some of you know the person Edward Said. And when Hassan Nasrallah was a young man, Edward Said met him. And he wrote just briefly about him because he wasn't well known at the time when Professor Said wrote about him. And he said, there's two things about Nasrallah which differ from any other Arab leader he said I've ever met. Number one, he was always on time. No, it's a sign. It's a sign of seriousness. The other Arab leaders, they come in 5 hours late, like they're so important, and everybody else's time is unimportant. So they'll come in 5 hours late, 7 hours late, and he was always on time. And number two, all the other Arab leaders he met, meaning Professor Said, they were always surrounded by armed militia with their machine guns. He said when he met Hassan Nasrallah, no, none of those theatrics. It was serious. He read. I remember Professor Chomsky met him. They met for a serious amount of time. And you ask Professor Chomsky, so what was he like? And Professor Chomsky will say, you don't really know because all he did was ask questions. He just wanted to suck in information. He wasn't there to show off, to show how much, how important he is. He wanted to learn. It was serious. He made errors. We all make errors. At the end, pure speculation. I admit it, pure speculation. I think he died a martyr's death. He knew he wanted to be killed because he had what you call command responsibility. And there were many mistakes made at the end. There were deep penetrations of Hezbollah intelligence. And also, he was the last of his generation. Israel had assassinated in those months all of the senior leaders except him. And I think there was a feeling that he wanted to die an honorable death, because anybody who knew Hezbollah, they had headquarters buried deep inside mountains. They said, I don't know if it's true, you could have dropped an atomic bomb in the mountain and it still wouldn't penetrate their headquarters. So why did he go to the Dahya? He knew there were 10,000 spies there that Israel was watching it. Israel was bombing it all week. I think he died a martyr's death, and it was an honorable death. I think it was a mistake because it left a huge gap, but that's his calculation. Apart from him, the rest are all from hunger.
You've mentioned some examples of militant actions that some Arab countries or entities stationed in Arab countries have taken. And you've also mentioned nonviolent civil resistance, but you've also been a vocal critic of the boycott, divestment, sanction movement in the past, despite its goal of applying nonviolent pressure on Israel to comply with international law. Given the scale of the atrocities in Gaza, mass killing and destruction, apartheid, many argue that BDS is one of the few tools available to hold or to legitimately hold Israel accountable. So why do you oppose BDS, and do you still stand by that position in light of Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza?
I want to answer two questions there. I'll get to the second one, and obviously I'm not going to evade it. I'm happy to answer any questions that are put to me. I want to just go through the record of what Hamas tried. It comes to power in 2006, in January 2006. Hamas didn't want to run in the elections. For those of you who remember back then, President Bush, who now as compared to what came after him seems like a veritable saint, President Bush was in this mode called democracy promotion. It was right after the invasion of Iraq. We're going to promote democracy in the Arab world. So they ordered the Palestinians to hold elections. Hamas didn't want to participate in those elections. They said those elections were part of what they called the Oslo process, which was just legitimizing the Israeli occupation. They didn't want to be part of it. They're pressured, and they finally agree to participate. They didn't run on any ideological platform. They ran on a very simple platform. They ran on a platform of reform, because the Palestinian Authority was, is, and always has been completely corrupt. So it runs on the platform of reform, and it wins the election. What happens? First of all, Jimmy Carter, who was one of the observers at the elections, he pronounced them completely honest and fair. That's his words. They were completely honest and fair. Okay. So what happens? Hamas wins the parliamentary elections, and they come to power. Hillary Clinton, that great Democrat, she says our big mistake was, she said our big mistake was we didn't rig the election. That was our error.
Sounds like something she would say.
Yeah. Yeah. When she rigs the election, that's democracy. But when she claims Putin did, which of course is ridiculous, then that's no good. Only Americans are allowed to rig elections. So she says that was our mistake. So they come into power, and immediately this brutal blockade is put on Gaza, this medieval blockade, which has been pronounced on a couple of occasions. It's a crime against humanity, this blockade in Gaza. Most people don't even know the details. You know, they blocked any chocolate from entering Gaza. They blocked any potato chips from entering Gaza. They blocked any baby chicks from entering Gaza. They blocked any seasonings from entering Gaza. The list of things they blocked was so long that they discarded the list and then just drew up a list of what was admitted into Gaza. And if you read the memos at the time, it said the purpose of the blockade was to keep Gaza on the edge of collapse so that the people will overthrow Hamas. It was a calculated policy to force the people. For those of you who go way back, it was the same thing what Henry Kissinger said when the socialist government came to power in Chile, the Allende government. He said, we're going to keep turning the screws in Chile until, and I'm quoting him now, the economy screams. And that's what they were trying to do in Gaza. So what did Hamas do? First of all, it tried diplomacy. Now some people snicker and laugh, ha ha ha, Hamas diplomacy, what a joke. You must be a Hamas apologist, a propagandist. The United States Office for Peace, it said Hamas was moving towards a diplomatic settlement of the conflict based on international law. There's a whole number of initiatives they took that were completely ignored. Then Hamas tried international law. After each of Israel's mowings of the lawn in Gaza, the various human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and also missions commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council, they go to Gaza to investigate what happened. Of course, Israel won't cooperate with any human rights investigation. You might wonder why, if you're naive, why it wouldn't cooperate. What does Hamas do? It's an interesting story. Nobody has said anything about it. The human rights organizations, the UN missions of inquiry, they were always ruthless with Hamas. They would say, you're guilty of war crimes, you're guilty of crimes against humanity, you're guilty of this, you're guilty of that. And you know what? Hamas didn't care. It was willing, and it did cooperate with all the human rights investigations, even though the human rights groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the UN missions, even though they said that Hamas was guilty of significant war crimes, in my opinion, highly exaggerated, but I can't go into that now. So, what happened? I'll tell you what happened. The reports came out. They were all very critical of Hamas, but also of Israel. And in fact, more so Israel in most cases. What happened to the reports? I'll tell you what happened to the reports. You know what happened to the reports? They were put in a desk and they collected dust. At the organizations and in my apartment, they sit in the bookshelves, thousands and thousands, I'm serious, and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of reports where Hamas thought, maybe if we follow this route, maybe something will be vindicated from this horror. Nothing came of it. So that route was a dead end. And then in March 2018, and I will say in part at my instigation, I kept saying you should try nonviolent civil resistance. I talked to one member of Hamas, a senior member who we had I won't say talk to, we had a steady correspondence. I thought it would work. Well, you know what happened? We know exactly what happened. Because there was a UN report issued after what was called the Great March of Return. And it's a 250-page report. It's single-spaced. And what does the report tell us? It tells us that Israel lined up its best snipers along the perimeter fence with Gaza. It tells us that every bullet fired hit its mark. Every bullet fired by those snipers hit their mark. And do you know what they hit? Go read the report. The report says the snipers targeted children, targeted medics, targeted journalists, and targeted people with disabilities, double amputees they targeted here. So when you read the horrors coming out of Gaza the past 16 months, about them targeting children in the skull and in the chest, for those who know the history, nothing new under the sun. In magnitude, of course, very different, but in quality, no, it's not new. Quantity, yes. Quality, no. And at that point, Hamas had exhausted all options. Tried diplomacy, tried international law, tried nonviolent civil resistance, and all of them reached a dead end. And that was basically, without trying to be dramatic about it, being factual about it, it was basically a death sentence for the people of Gaza. Because by 2020, Gaza had vanished from the news. Some of you will remember at that point, all the talk in the town was about the Abraham Accords and whether the Saudis would sign them. And Gaza was just forgotten, this forgotten patch of land called Gaza. And it basically meant for the population, which is overwhelmingly a child population, most of the people who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th, most of them had been born into Gaza after the siege, after the blockade. It's a fact that even I found quite surprising. Beginning in the 1950s, every outside observer who goes to Gaza keeps saying the same thing. You know, they keep saying under the Egyptians from the 50s to 67, and then under Israel, they keep saying Gaza is a concentration camp. That's not my language. That's not my inflammatory language. That's what everybody says. You know who includes everybody? It includes the former Israeli chief of National Security Council, Giora Eiland. Giora Eiland is a monster. He is a monster. He was the one, for those of you who are unfamiliar, who has been advocating the past 15 months. He said it's a good thing if we can spread epidemics in Gaza. That's what he said. It's a good thing if we can spread epidemics in Gaza. So he's not a peacenik. And you know how he described Gaza in 2004? Quote, a huge concentration camp. So they try diplomacy, it fails. They try international law, it fails. They try nonviolent civil resistance, it fails. Gaza by 2020 is forgotten. I've forgotten Gaza. I decided it was hopeless. It was well, I try, they tried everything. And by 2020, as I said, before somebody who's semi-retarded interrupted me, I said that even I had given up. I had moved on. I decided it was pointless. The last book I wrote on Gaza, it sold 370 copies, of which I purchased half. So it didn't seem any point anymore. So what did that mean? I said effectively a death sentence had been pronounced in Gaza. 60% of the people, young people in Gaza, 60% were unemployed. So what did that mean? They get up in the morning and all they have to do, literally, is pace the perimeter of Gaza 26 miles by 5 miles. There's nothing to do. It's a living death. And those were overwhelmingly the folks who burst the gates on October 7th. So for those who want to criticize them, condemn them, attack them, uh, I do think it's a fair question to ask, what were their options? What option did they have except to choose to be born into, to languish in, and to die in a concentration camp? What options did they really have? I won't go into that question right now. If you have, you can ask me during questions and answers. So that's the important point for me. The record what Hamas attempted. Now, the question is about the solidarity movement here. What have people attempted? What has worked? What hasn't worked? Um, First of all, it would be I would have to be certifiably insane uh, not to support boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. Of course, those are just standard tactics. I go far back enough to the what was called the International Anti-Apartheid movement, and I was in graduate school at the time, and we called for the university's divestment from South Africa. So obviously, and I was part of that movement. So, and it was also going way back. Anyone in my generation here will remember Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union. How many people remember Cesar Chavez? Just a few. And that was a very important struggle of the 1970s, the right of Chicanos to organize in the southwest of the United States. And the movement was led by the United Farm Workers. It was led by Cesar Chavez, who was a mixed record, I would say. But of course, I was part of that. We were boycotting at the time grapes and wine. Those were the two, and the lettuce, grapes, wine, and lettuce, in support of the United Farm Workers. So obviously, on principle, I would have to be certifiably insane to oppose boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. My disagreements with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, it's really two main things. Number one, the BDS movement was born in July 2005. And the date is important because it was 1 year after the International Court of Justice, which we talked about earlier, had declared that the wall that Israel was building in the West Bank was illegal under international law. And it called on Israel to not build the wall. Of course, Israel ignored the ICJ. And so the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was born to try to create a popular movement to enforce international law. Because at the level of states, the law as pronounced by the International Court of Justice was being ignored. So the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was born. And they have a platform. And the platform states that they support international law, the implementation of international law. And they said we have three main planks. Plank number one, end occupation. Plank number two, equal rights for Palestinians in Israel. And plank number three, implement the right of return for Palestinian refugees. That was its basic platform. It still is. That's their basic platform. And I said, my reading of the international law is the same as yours. Palestinians have the right of equality in the state of Israel. Palestinians, the occupation is illegal under international law. That's only recently been pronounced, but ending the occupation was certainly a legitimate demand. And the third was implementing the right of return. I said, but there's a problem here. Not a problem for me, but I believe a problem for you. Because whether you agree with it or not, international law also says Israel's a state and has the right to self-determination. Everybody knows that. That's not a controversial question. Israel is a member state of the United Nations. And every single document in the United Nations, every document in the General Assembly and the Security Council, and including in the ICJ opinion of 2004, it said that to resolve the conflict, there have to be two states on the June 1967 border. The BDS movement, as many of you know, refused that aspect. They said they don't recognize Israel's right to self-determination. We're agnostic on that question and we won't take a stand on it. I said, that's a problem because the law is a package deal. You have a right, everybody in this room has a right to walk at the green. But if you have a right to walk at the green light, guess what? You have an obligation to stop at the red light. The two are reciprocal. Rights come with responsibilities. Rights come with obligations. If you walk at the green light and a police officer stops you, you can legitimately claim, I had the right. But if you walk at the red light and the police officer stops you, you can't say, well, I'm agnostic on the red light. I have a right to walk at the green, but I'm an agnostic on the red. No, you can't be. You can't pick and choose with the law. Either you believe in the law or you don't. And BDS, in my opinion, and it remains the same, is hypocritical. It wants the parts of the law that it likes, just like Israel wants the parts of the law that it likes. It likes the fact that it's regarded as a state. It doesn't like the aspect about Palestinians also being a state. And if Israel's being hypocritical, so is the BDS movement, in my opinion. And there's a second aspect, which is, and I don't want to sound condescending here, I don't want to sound patronizing, and I don't want to sound like a know-it-all, because those are all obnoxious traits, and anyone who exhibits them makes him or herself look obnoxious. But politics is a difficult game. You have to study hard. You have to work hard. You have to think hard. It's not just one slogan. It's not abracadabra presto. And with the BDS movement, anything you say, it's just BDS. BDS. As if it's a panacea, a cure-all. No, you have to analyze each situation and base it on your determination at a particular situation. What's the best slogan? What will rally the most people? What can achieve the most at any given moment? And that's not easy. That's not easy at all to figure out. There are a few people who I thought were utterly brilliant at coming up with the right slogans. Sometimes the slogans are right, but they're horrible. One called Make America Great Again, but it resonated. But from the point of view of the movement and the tradition of which I consider myself part, the most brilliant by far, was Bernie Sanders. He understood exactly how you build a radical movement. Number one, find those slogans that resonate with, as it came to be called after the Occupy movement, with the 99%. So what were his slogans? Everybody knows Medicare for all, double the minimum wage, end student debt, end college tuition, Green New Deal. And then he just kept repeating it and repeating it and repeating it. And some people said, oh God, I'm so tired of him saying that. Can't he say anything new? But no, he was very smart because he understood that your average American is not a political junkie. Your average American is going to only hear him once. We heard him 100 times, but that's because we follow politics, but most people don't. So he was going to take every opportunity to keep repeating the slogan, get 10 new people here, 5 new people here, until there's a real movement. If you were asked me now, and hopefully we'll go into it at some detail, I think the most important slogan now is free Gaza, free speech. I think it has a real possibility of drawing the overwhelming majority on every college campus. Even people who don't care about Gaza, they care about free speech. That's just one of those sacred American values which everybody takes to heart. And right now, the struggle for free speech is inextricably intertwined with the struggle of free Gaza. And I think you can get, in my opinion, you can get a supermajority on any college campus, any and every college campus in the country to support that slogan. You just have T-shirts on the back. It says Israel, Gaza, genocide. And the front it says free speech. And get people, and you get people to wear it. You have a free speech. You have a free Gaza free speech every Wednesday. Ask people to wear those T-shirts. And then you aim for maybe April 1st, where we're taking back our rights. Every college campus, we're setting up an encampment again. We're taking our rights back. In our Constitution, freedom of speech is inseparable from freedom of assembly. And if you go back as far as John Stuart Mill and On Liberty, he says it's impossible to support the right of free speech without supporting the right of free assembly. You had the right to set up the encampments. They were not an encumbrance on anyone. They did not block anyone. If you go from one college campus to the other, and I went to quite a few, there was always a harmonious relationship between the encampments and the rest of the community. Not everybody was prepared to make the degree of sacrifice to join the encampment. It meant, a significant subtraction of your free time. And in many cases, a subtraction from the time you can focus on your studies. So a large number of people, they weren't prepared for that degree or level of commitment, but they supported the encampments. It's a complete fraud and fakery to say that those encampments were in a contentious relationship with the community. There were a handful of people who wanted to shut down those encampments and discredit them. And unfortunately, that handful of people had behind them a lot of money. There was this billionaire Jewish supremacist class, and they brought to bear their donor power because they give a lot of money to the universities, and the universities folded one after another after another. It was the biggest assault on academic freedom in our country's history. It was. Now, some of you might say, what about the McCarthy era? Okay, that was terrible, no question about it. But here's a simple question. How many college presidents were deposed during the McCarthy era? How many? During the past 15 months, the president of Harvard was deposed. The president of another Ivy League university, McGill, at University of Pennsylvania, was deposed. President Shafiq, another Ivy League university, Columbia, was deposed. That never happened before. It just didn't.
And our chancellor conveniently is stepping down in May, just so you know, chancellor here at UWM.
Uh-huh. And why is he stepping down?
Unclear.
uh, and and this is the challenge for the young people. It's a challenge for your future. It really is. There is a very dark shadow being cast over our country. It did not begin with Trump. That's just a factual lie. It began with Joe Biden, and didn't really even begin with Joe Biden. It began with the capture of our country by this handful of billionaires. And just the other day, I was listening to Bernie Sanders. I recognize all of his flaws. But I was listening to him, and he said, standing behind Trump was Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg. Those three people control more wealth than the bottom half of our whole country. Those three people control more wealth than half of our country. And the main manifestation now of this control by power and wealth is the systematic erosion of our right to free speech. That's a serious problem. And I believe that the young people can play, if we can use the expression, a vanguard role in seizing back, in wresting back that right to free speech. Now, I have no doubt that it's going to put you on a collision course, not just with your college administrations, it's going to put you on a collision course with the Trump administration. And it won't be easy. It's going to be a very tough battle. But I'm old enough to remember in our own country what a battle it was to try to end the system of segregation in the American South. That took courage beyond human comprehension, because we're talking about not people who have all the protections of attending college, of belonging relatively to an elite. These were the grassroots of Southern society who tried to overturn a very ugly, deeply entrenched system of power. And they had no protections. Quite the contrary. When they're trying to get people to attend the demonstration, they would go into the little hamlets in the American South where the chief of police belonged to the Ku Klux Klan, the mayor belonged to the Ku Klux Klan, all the police belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. And when you knocked on a door and asked somebody to attend a demonstration, it was pretty much a death sentence. and large numbers of them went to jail. Large numbers. Some of you will know the song, Ain't Afraid of Your Jails. And when you went into a Southern jail and you were Black, it wasn't all that certain that you would come out. They found the courage, and one hopes that the young people will too, because it's not like you're fighting for someone else. Yes, you're fighting for Gaza, but you're also fighting for yourself and your future, which is being incrementally, day by day, it's being robbed from you. It's being stolen. Your future is being stolen. 3 people have more wealth than half our country. So you're fighting for Gaza. You're also fighting for yourself, because once you lose that right to free speech and free assembly, there's really very little left to fight with. So I believe that's the right slogan for the moment, which gets back to your question. I don't believe there's a blanket abracadabra presto solution. You have to analyze at a particular moment. Now, I believe the right slogan is not BDS, it's free Gaza, free speech. We're taking back our rights. That's my opinion.
And you actually preemptively answered my last question, which is what's a piece of public advice that you would give us as, I guess, student activists or organizers or just activists around the country? I want to
just say one last thing on that. I teach at a public, when I'm allowed to teach, I teach at a public university. And most of the students are immigrants or poor whites. It's people trying to realize that American dream against all the odds. And one thing I can tell you is uh, the web has had a very big negative effect on the mental development of the new generations. But that having been said, students are very smart. They're very, their minds are nimble. Don't ask me how, but they do. They stay quite alert. They're quite nimble. Yesterday I had a class, I'm teaching the laws of war. I have 40 students. It was a crowded class. Several Palestinians took the course because they wanted to take a class with me. And we were supposed to be talking about the Geneva Convention. And before you know, one student is shouting at another, "You sound like a Zionist." And I think, oh, no. Guys, you want me to lose my job on the first day? Don't go there. But it was actually quite energetic, quite dynamic. Young people are smart. They are. So my main advice is rely on yourself. Think, argue, figure out how to go forward. Be serious. Be serious. It's about Gaza and it's about you. It's about both. Be serious. And I think, you have to combine 2 things. You have to combine the energy and the idealism of youth with the wisdom and experience of age. Don't defer just to wisdom and experience, because sometimes wisdom and experience make you kind of pessimistic about the world. And the great thing about young people, they still have ideals, they still hope, and they have lots of energy, lots and lots of energy. So you combine the idealism and the energy of youth with the wisdom and experience of age, and I think you can figure it out. I think you could figure out how to go forward. I would say 2 important things are to make it national contact other universities, other colleges, hold a conference, a convention, hammer out those principles which will resonate, like Bernie's Medicare for All, figure out what's going to resonate. And also, because of the threats now of deportations of foreign students and all that sort of stuff, to have a vow. And the vow is, as the Four Musketeers said, all for one and one for all. Nobody's going to jail alone. And we won't accept anybody being isolated and punished. You stick together. And if you stick together, my view is they have the money. They have the power. They control the media. They control the university administrations now. But we have the numbers. And if we can organize those numbers, I believe we can win.
Thank you for that piece of advice. We're going to go back and transcribe everything and make sure that we get all of that in writing. And I'd like to open the session to a Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and someone will come around to you with a microphone. Just give it a couple more seconds, see who's brave. Okay, just raise your hand really high up if you have a question.
Yes. Okay, my name is Jan Van Schaik. I have a wonky question and then maybe a more substantive current question. The wonky question is about tribalism. And as you look at Hezbollah and the Houthis, primarily supported by Shia, and other groups mainly supported by Sunni, what is the role of the Sunni-Shia divide? And the second, in terms of free speech, free Palestine, one problem that I might see with that is a lot of people saying, well, how free is speech in Palestine? Can people in Palestine speak freely? Can you be transgender in Palestine? It invites considerable criticism.
On the first question, I claim absolutely zero expertise or knowledge beyond the layperson. One thing I have noticed, I'm not sure if it's true in Milwaukee, but in New York, Yemenis control the groceries. It's called, a segmented labor market. There's always one ethnic group that controls the taxis, one ethnic group that controls the janitors in buildings. And it happens right now. The Yemenis are the ones who own all the groceries in New York. And as you can imagine, the Houthis are pretty ruthless. Domestically, they are not Mother Teresa. But even though there are significant divides among the Yemenis, they all support what the Houthis are doing with regard to Palestine. There, the ethnic element or religious element, whichever it is transcended by a solidarity. You will never hear a non-Houthi Yemeni condemn the Houthis on Palestine. That's been my experience, and I talk to a lot of Yemeni grocers who don't like the Houthis, by the way, who don't like them, but that particular question. As the question of the rights of free speech in Gaza, there's very limited. Well, you can't be altogether shocked by it because there are many reasons, but one obviously is the siege. Our country, as you know, Abraham Lincoln abolished habeas corpus during the Civil War. um, there is a siege, and uh, the fact remains, for all of the deficits in Palestinian society, they did have the first free, and some people say no, it was Tunisia, but uh, the first or the second free election in the Arab world. And what was the reaction? To crush them for having won. That's not a terrific way to educate people about the virtues of democracy.
Hi. So if you're in the position of arguing that Israel must be pressured to accept, to allow a two-state solution, and the response comes some form of the answer that pressure Israel to agree to what? Because Palestinians can't sort of speak with one voice, can't sort of agree on what they would accept from their side. And then variations on the language that Israel doesn't have a partner to peace, for peace, and so on. How do you respond to those people?
The first way I would respond is Hamas as a major political force came along pretty late in the day. It only is established in 1987 in Gaza. If you look at the documentary record, the Palestinians supported, via its representative organization, the PLO, the Palestinians supported a two-state settlement from the early 1970s. I think the record is pretty solid there. I can refer you later to some things you might want to look at. So it was not as if the Palestinians, it was not as if Israel didn't have a peace partner. As a matter of fact, in 1982, Israel invades Lebanon. And it was a very brutal invasion. They killed between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. And then if you look at the single best study of the Lebanon war, it's called Dilemmas of Security by an Israeli, he's passed, Avner Yaniv, who was a very mainstream Israeli historian or political scientist. He says, why does Israel invade Lebanon? Well, it invades Lebanon, obviously, because that's where the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, that's where it's headquartered. But why does it want to destroy the PLO? And do you know why, he says? Because of the PLO's, and I'm quoting his phrase, not mine, because of the PLO's peace offensive, that the Palestinians wanted to settle the conflict on the basis of international law, two states along the June 1967 border, et cetera, et cetera. They want to settle it. Israel doesn't want to settle it. Why? Because it wants to keep the territories. But it's afraid that the PLO is becoming too moderate. And if it's too moderate, then pressure is going to be put on Israel to settle the conflict. So they want to radicalize. They want to radicalize the PLO. And so it attacks the PLO in Lebanon. And then what do Palestinians conclude from that? They conclude there's no way to make peace with Israel. So they go back to armed resistance. So I don't think historically the problem has not been an absence of a peace partner. The problem was Israel doesn't want to give up what it took in 1967. Now, you might say now there's a problem because there's a schism, I would say, between the PLO and or it's called the Palestinian Authority, and the other main contender for power, Hamas, I would say that's something for them to resolve, something for them to figure out. I'm not sure how it will be done, but it seems to me, it doesn't change the fact that both the Palestinian Authority now and Hamas, they were ready to settle. They were ready to settle. Even if you look at the most recent statements of Bassem Naim, who's their main international political spokesman. He's, by the way, a very smart guy. I only discovered belatedly he has 2 PhDs from German universities. They were all actually quite smart. I forgot which one of them. He graduated first in his class in pediatrics. Who was that? I can't remember. No, they're a smart bunch, competent, the Hamas people. The politics, I disagree with significantly, but they're smart. And in any case, Bassem Naim has always, if you listen to his statements lately, he says we want our own state, which is different than the formulation of we want 48 back. So they're still within the range of you can have negotiations with them and see where they go. But the Israelis are just off the spectrum. No, it's kind of shocking. And I'm not one easily shocked. I'm too old and I've seen too much to be shocked. But when you read the compilations, there's one by Lee Mordechai, Mordechai, Lee, of just statements at the Israeli government from the top to the bottom, across the political spectrum, and every division of civil society. Or you look at the statement, a new one, by an also Jewish professor from Sciences Po in Paris. His last name is Schatz, Shatz. Or you look at the South African submission from May 29th, 2024. This is not what Israel has done in Gaza is not a state project. It's not. It's a national project. It's the whole of Israeli society is acting in concert in this genocide in Gaza. Just on the plane ride over here today, I was reading one of the compilations for the second time, the one from South Africa, and I desperately tried to get inside the mindset of these people. The sheer brazenness, the flagrancy of posting all of these videos on the social media, relishing and rejoicing in the extermination of a people. The songs that they have composed. It's hard to think of a parallel. Remember, one of the alibis of the Germans after the war was they didn't know. Now, in fact, as my late mother used to say, she was referring to the war in Vietnam, but she passed through the Nazi Holocaust, and it was also in reference to Germans. Those who want to know, know. And those who don't want to know will never know. So the Germans who wanted to know they knew. They may not have known about the explicit details of the gas chambers. That's possible. But half of the Jews who were exterminated, they were exterminated just out in the killing fields. They weren't exterminated in the death camps. It was out in the open. So it would be very implausible to say that German soldiers, when they came back from the front, they didn't report what was happening. That I find highly implausible. But at least they could pretend to this alibi of they didn't know. But there's no alibi with the Israelis. They know. They know because it's on the social media. They know because commentators every night say what's going on and enthuse on what's going on. They say it every night on television programs. They sing songs, pop songs, yes, pop songs, about exterminating the people and destroying everything in Gaza. And it's just very difficult to get inside that mindset. So I say to myself, well, October 7th, yeah, that probably really shook them up. I don't go for the denial about October 7th. Horrible things happened. The rapes did not happen. The beheadings did not happen, but probably on the order of 850 civilians were killed, overwhelmingly by Hamas militants. I'm not going to argue with that fact. I might try to explain the fact. I'm not going to argue it. So I say maybe the horror of October 7th, maybe. But then I ask myself, I'm old enough to remember 9/11. Even President Bush, if you remember, made gestures to show solidarity with the Muslim community back then. And it was horrible, happened to be my city, but it was, pretty traumatic what happened. And our country did not react the way the Israelis reacted. It's very hard to fathom, and it would require, serious reflection and investigation. The closest I think there was to that was, if you read our own history, the extermination of the Native Americans, because that incited the same kind of relish that the extermination of the Palestinians did. I'll even tell you an anecdotal story. This man, young man, you're gonna like this story, okay? So we were so homicidal in our hatred of the Indians, who we never called Indians, we called them savages. By the way, no Israeli will ever refer to a Palestinian as anything except a terrorist. That's just the nomenclature. And we had the same thing here with the savages. We just called them savages. So I'm a kid, not a young man, I'm a kid. I'm watching the cowboy and Indian movies, TV shows. And they were very popular in the 1950s, cowboys and Indians. And you can imagine, I'm always identifying with the cowboys. And also with the famous people in the West. There was Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Lieutenant Rip Masters. And I remember I'm sitting in front of my TV set and I'm watching it, and I'm not proud of it, but I'm speaking honestly. Kill those savages. Kill those savages. There was one scene in one TV show where they're launching these fireballs the cowboys are launching the fireballs on the teepees of the Indians, the savages, and I was euphoric. And that's the Israelis now. That's the Israelis now. It's a complete, total, across the board horror show. It's like 9/11, October 7th, freed up the id in the Israelis, all the hatred and contempt they felt for Arabs, they now felt it had all been legitimized by October 7th, and they can let out all of the accumulated ugliness inside them, and they could do it righteously, self-righteously, that October 7th legitimized their right and obligation to exterminate these subhumans in Gaza. So, in that context, to talk about looking for a partner for peace, it strikes me as being completely irrelevant.
Okay, looks like there's a, yeah, and then we're going to the front row right after. You can ask your question, yeah.
First, thank you for being here. The wealth of information and history is overwhelming. I just have a side comment, but not my main question, about the reaction of the United States after 9/11. It was a terrifying reaction by invading Iraq.
That's correct.
And 1.5 million Iraqi killed for no reason. So there's blood on their
wanna-
hands as well.
I totally agree with that. I was saying the reaction of the American people. And my distinct recollection was, I was at that point teaching at DePaul University in Chicago. And everybody at the university made a determined effort to make the Muslim and Arab students feel welcome. That's not what happened after October 7th in Israel.
And my main question is about the PDS.
Mhm.
You are comparing PDS as an organization with a single mission of divest and what so-called democratic state that signed treaties and supposed to follow the international law and trying to be part of the international community. And they claim to be the only democratic country in the Middle East. Do you feel this is a fair comparison?
When you say a fair comparison, the comparison with what?
The PDS movement versus what so-called State of Israel and her relationship with other countries and the laws they're supposed to follow.
I'm not sure, and maybe there's a misunderstanding here. My concern was, I did not believe that one can make a persuasive case in the public for trying to win people over to your point of view if you are selective and pick and choose with international law. Because if you come before a public, say this audience, and you say you support international law, which is what BDS says, and then you say, in support of BDS, I think the occupation has to end. I believe that Palestinians have the right to equal rights in the state of Israel. And then somebody calls out from the audience and says, well, you say you support international law. But international law says Israel is a state. Do you support that aspect of international law? And then I can do one of two things. One is I can lie and say, no, international law doesn't say that. That's not true. Or two, I could pretend, I could say I'm an agnostic. I don't take a position on that. Well, the moment you say you don't take a position on that, then the person says, fine, and I don't take a position on the Palestinian right to a state. I lose. I don't see how you can persuade anyone if you're being hypocritical. I don't see. Now, yes, if you're speaking to a choir who agrees with you, of course they're going to cheer what you have to say. But I don't think that's what politics is about. Politics is trying to organize, mobilize large masses of people. And I don't think you can persuade them if you're being hypocritical. That's my concern. And I don't want to be hypocritical. If people believe in me, they believe it because what I say, they know I believe what I say. And I don't want to be two-faced about it. And well, we'll leave it at that.
I know a lot of people were shocked with the recent statement by President Trump that he's going to turn Gaza into basically a Riviera and take over. I actually found it to be amusing, and I thought that there's some truth to this in the sense that it was put out because Trump is not a politician and he says what's basically happening. And I think what was made very clear is that this is a case of ethnic cleansing, and the fact that Netanyahu stood there smirking next to him, I think for the entire world now to say, including the students that have been harassed by the university for asking for divestment, etc., then now it's for the entire world to see that this is a case of ethnic cleansing, and it's intentional. I think also it's going to make it a little bit more difficult for Arab governments, as tyrannical and non-representative as they are, to stand with someone like Trump and to say, yeah, we want to work with you, when he clearly said, I'm going to ethnically cleanse Gaza.
Well, I happen to agree with all of those statements. I think you would have to be more blind than King Lear not to see what was going on the last 15 months. It was an ethnic cleansing which didn't succeed at the beginning because Egypt said no go into the Sinai. And then it became an ethnic cleansing by default, namely, there's nothing left. And so the people have to go. And I have to acknowledge it is a tough question now. What do you do? There is nothing there. And I don't have, people want to conjure these heroic images of Palestinians. And yes, they've been extremely tenacious and they've been heroic. But at the end of the day, they're human beings. They're not supermen and they're not superwomen. So if you read the stories, yes, they did march en masse to the north after the ceasefire began. But if you read the footnotes, when they went to the north and they discovered nothing was there and there was no water, a lot of them turned around and went back to the south to their tents. It doesn't make them less heroic. It was completely, if you read the statements of the Israelis, the ones that are not reported here, but are in abundance when you read them, collected, that was the whole goal, to make Gaza unlivable, so that the people of Gaza would have two choices: stay and starve or leave. That was the goal. Now, you could deduce the goal on the basis of what they were saying, or you could deduce it or infer it from their actions. If you destroy 92% of the housing, what choice do the people of Gaza have?
They could go to lock up there. They should go there. Their houses,
I'm not going to argue with that. I will simply say politics is about the balance of forces. In the current balance of forces in the world, I do not consider that that is a plausible option.
it's a conflict. It's not a conflict. We just answer the question. It's not a conflict between Palestinians and Israel. There is so much difference in our environment. We are the Hamas and all of them. They are freedom resistant.
I've never said contrary to that. I've,
They're
ne-
not.
I've never said contrary to that.
Yeah.
I don't think
If
there's.
you want to take them from Gaza, as I said, let them go to where they belong. You know all the people of Gaza from where? They are from Jaffa, from Haifa, from Lid, from Ramla. The Israeli kicked them out. They should go back to their homeland. That's where they should go. I want to repeat it again. I heard you saying so many times conflict, and you know, but there is big difference.
I do.
That's a big
With
difference.
all
It's
due
not a
re-
conflict.
with all due
It's not.
respect, I would be the last person in the world to want to get into a quarrel with you on this matter. But since October 7th, I think with no exception, at least in public, I was the one person who kept insisting it's not a war, it's a genocide.
It's a genocide.
I said it over and over and over and over again. I said it at least a half dozen times.
Thank you for existing. It's genocide. It is genocide.
Yes, so I didn't define it or describe it as a conflict. I described it as a genocide.
Okay, we can take one or two more questions.
Out of respect, please don't interrupt the questioner and Norman for answering the questions. Just out of
Yes.
respect for the people that are being patient. Thank you.
All right, so would you say that there is any hope to de-radicalize the youth within Israel, or is their Zionist belief too deep-rooted?
Can
If
you
so-
ask that question one more time?
Yes, so is there any hope to de-radicalize the youth within Israel, or is their Zionist beliefs too deep-rooted? And if so, how should that process be made?
What you call the youth are the ones who are in the front line carrying out the genocide inside Gaza. They're the most over the top. So anyone looking for hope there, I think it's an utter waste of time. You know, you ask, in some situations, there's no rational grounds for hope for a population. If you take the United States during the Civil Rights Movement, the whites in the South were very dug in. You can count on the fingers of one hand the number of whites in any town who supported an end to the Jim Crow segregation system. The only way to break it was when the federal government, for various reasons, decided it was time to end that system. And they brought to bear, for various reasons, the full weight of our national government, including its armed force, to break the will of the South, to look for quote unquote progressive whites in the American South was a complete waste of time. It didn't exist. And I don't believe there is any quote unquote progressive progressive is, let's just call it, there's no significant anti-genocide sentiment inside Israel. As Lee Mordechai pointed out in his compilation, Israel's most revered uh, newspaper for its liberal sentiments is Haaretz. And there was very little dissent, he said, in Haaretz, which liberals here love to quote. It was very little dissent. He said in his compilation, he said Haaretz went along with the genocide. That's the liberal, ultra-liberal sectors of Israeli society. It's a complete, it's a uniform response across the board there. And as I said, it's pretty hard to fathom when you read it.
Okay, and we're going to take one last question.
I would like that gentleman who has his hand up, because I think he'll disagree with me. Yes, you, the one who, yes, because I think he's going to disagree with me, and I appreciate disagreement. Yeah.
Your spidey sense is going on.
Only like slight disagreement. I think I understand what you're saying about BDS. I think I understand the criticism, and I somewhat agree about being genuine with our slogans, because I think it's really important. But as someone who thinks uniting the student movement and the national liberation movements with the labor movement as like one of the most critical aspects of solidarity with Palestine, don't you think that, you know, this concept of demanding, you know, the right to return, the end of occupation, and the other demands of the BDS movement that are, at least on the surface, legal compared to international law, and you saying that it's demanding like an end to Israel as a state, wouldn't that be like a secondary effect? And if anything, it's really just like a transitional demand that we could be like the best bet for getting like labor in this country on board with solidarity, because they've been mostly silent for the most part.
I think the best bet, to use your expression, is to be honest, to be truthful, to be non-duplicitous, to be unhypocritical, and to reach the limits of what would seem or appear to be, to most people, to be reasonable, a reasonable settlement and solution of the question. And I don't believe that certain of the claims that are made will be persuasive to most people as being reasonable. And I think we have to always, and it's hard when you're young in particular, there's a tendency, and I was very far from being an exception. I was part of it. In fact, I was probably among the worst. There is a tendency to strike radical poses because it makes you feel good. It makes you feel purer and holier than everybody else. But that's not politics. That's a kind of moral posturing. You stand there and you show how pure you are. Politics is, I believe, you look at the balance of political forces. What's possible, what's not possible. Now, the balance of political forces also takes into account where you think reasonably you could move people. Where can you move people? That maybe they're not completely conscious of what they want, and maybe you can push them, not push them, you can persuade them to go a little further. But if you want to build a movement, you have to base yourself on what is realistically possible in terms of persuading people. And I think a lot of the, I'll give you an example. So I'm attending a demonstration on Christmas Day in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And a woman starts shouting a slogan which many of you have heard. We don't want 2 states, we want 48. Okay, how many people have heard that slogan? And I'm thinking to myself, at this point, you're lucky if you get a ½ acre of land. We're in the middle of a genocide. the whole population's being wiped out, and you're talking about you want 48. That's a slogan of frustration and posturing. You have to figure out what will work at a particular moment. That's why you're always adjusting your slogans, because people's consciousness sometimes rises and sometimes lowers. And then you have to constantly adjust your slogans to what's possible based on where people are and the balance of power. So that, I think, those, I believe, are the right criteria. I thought that during the encampment movement, the slogan that the students seized on was "Ceasefire now." I thought that was the right slogan, because people were watching on their screens the horror that was being inflicted on the people of Gaza. And they just wanted that horror to end. Ceasefire now. And then there was an issue of whether it was going to be a partial or a permanent ceasefire. And then the student movement adjusted and said, we want a permanent ceasefire now, because there was the fear that there'd be a ceasefire, hostages freed, and then Israel would start right up again. So that was people being attentive to what was politically persuasive and possible at that particular moment. I happen to have thought it was very successful. That's why the Jewish billionaire class came in to crush it, because it was becoming a problem. You know, places like MIT, it was actually a quite moving sight, because the faculty at MIT, they couldn't join the encampments. You know, when you get older, you realize, you know, this is Woodstock and you don't belong there, okay? So what did they do? They were donating food and more food and more food. They were sending in tons of food. They wanted to show solidarity with the students. It was a very inspiring sight. I thought, in general, the encampments did everything pretty much right. And that's why they had to be crushed, because they were on the right path. Now, it's true at places like Colombia, all the unity collapsed. Problems arose, and anyone who's had experience with politics, when your numbers start to diminish, when you no longer have the broad support, it starts breaking down in these kinds of ugly factional fights. It's the ugly factional fights when you're reduced to a small number of people. But once you have a broad public behind you, the factional fights generally just disappear. Everybody understands what we need to hold this together, and they go along. Of course, there are going to be a few people. Most of the time, they're plants. You know, they're working for the other side. That's a fact. They're called Asian provocateurs, and that term was not invented. You can almost, for no reason, you can almost always spot an Asian provocateur. You know why? They're always saying the most lunatic, the most extreme ultra, slogans. And then they always, I remember Professor Chomsky, he once said to me, after the anti-war movement, there was all the release of all the files from what was called COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program. And it turns out all the people who were turned out to be government agents, they were the ultras. They were the ultras, because that's their job, to try to alienate the public by saying wild things, to alienate the public. But broadly, as I said, young people, they have common sense. They don't get carried away with the ultras and the ultra slogans. And if you reach out to that broad public, I think it keeps you sane, it keeps you steady, and it's doing what politics is supposed to do. It's winning over large masses of people to your cause. I'll say one last thing, and There are some disagreements about this. The biggest catastrophe that happened to the left was this whole insane woke culture, because they create a new standard of speech. We have not that, we have less people here, but we have enough people that it's worth remembering what I'm about to tell you. The whole struggle for free speech in our country was fought by people on the left: anarchists, communists, socialists, trade unionists. They fought for the right for things like, believe it or not, do you have the right to advocate the overthrow of your government? And that went to the Supreme Court many, many, many times. There's a very good book called A Worthy Struggle by this fellow named Harry Calvin from the University of Chicago. And he just goes through all the struggles that were fought. And believe it or not, our Supreme Court rules you have the right to advocate the overthrow of the government until and unless it reaches the point of actual use of force to overthrow the government. But you have the right. Now, in the 1980s, the signature struggle for civil liberty in our country, you know what it was? It was the battle or the right of Nazis to march through the community of Skokie, Illinois. And Skokie, Illinois was a community that had large numbers of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. Did the Nazis have the right of assembly to march through Skokie, Illinois? And you know what the state Supreme Court ruled? Yes. They had that right. And that was considered an important victory for free speech and assembly in the United States. And that's part of the left tradition. So along come these woke folks, and they say we're going to change the standard. The standard is no longer going to be free speech. It's my right not to feel unsafe. My right not to feel unwanted. My right not to feel uncomfortable. And I thought, okay, here is a disaster in the making. Why is it a disaster? If you turn to page 37 of a book I wrote called I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, you turn to page 37, I say, this is a disaster in the making. Why? Because if a Palestinian student says, I don't want an Israeli speaker to come to my campus because he makes me feel unsafe, unwanted, and uncomfortable. I said, if we use that standard, tomorrow, an Israeli student on campus is going to say, I don't want a Palestinian speaker to come because he makes me feel unsafe, unwanted, and uncomfortable. And I said, we're going to lose our most valuable weapon. As the person who introduced this event in the evening said, we have truth on our side. And we're going to lose the right to articulate the truth because the other side is going to say, I feel unwelcome, unwanted, uncomfortable. So I said, don't go down that path. But I missed a very big point. I got it right but I got it right only up to a point. You know what I missed? When we say it, it's all we have is our voices, which is compelling, but it's still just your voice. When the other side says it, they have Jewish supremacist billionaires who go to the university and say, we're not giving you any more donor money because Jewish students feel unsafe, unwanted, and uncomfortable. Now, there was a time when a university president would say, the whole purpose of college is to make you feel uncomfortable with your settled truths, to make you rethink the truths that you entered college with. It's supposed to make you uncomfortable. But now college presidents could latch on to the woke culture and say, yeah, these billionaires are right. Jewish students are feeling unsafe, unwanted, and uncomfortable, and therefore the encampments have to end. The denunciations of Israel have to end. So the woke culture played an extremely negative role in enabling and justifying the university administrations to shut down the encampments and also to shut down all discussion of Palestine. Most campuses now, you can't say a word. Places like Columbia are just an armed camp at this point. So I think I mentioned earlier that I thought it was important for students to organize on a national basis and for them to hold a conference and also to hammer out the principles. And I think one of the principles that they should include is there are not going to be any limits on speech. We're going back to the way it was in the 1980s, the 1990s. Look, I was in the college campus. We were allowed to set up a table. I did set up a table calling for the overthrow of the government. Yes, it's true. We never thought of it. We never thought of it as we were doing something illegal. That was part of our tradition. That was part of what it meant in our country. You could say I belong to a radical sect, it's true, and we would meet about overthrowing the government, and I'll say I was scared. I won't deny that. But we never thought about it as something illegal. Yes, there were provocateurs among us, but you couldn't legally silence us. That was our tradition. That's the American tradition. And it was fought for over a century. And it was a very sorry sight to watch this whole woke culture and this phenomenon called DEI kill that tradition. And we have to be self-critical. Where we make mistakes, we should acknowledge them. In life, everybody makes mistakes. That's part of life. The challenge in life is not to avoid making mistakes. Of course, you're going to make mistakes. You know what the challenge in life is? To learn from your mistakes. To learn. If you did something wrong, learn from it. And hopefully this generation, which their right to speech has been wrested, stolen. I hope they'll learn from the mistake of the woke culture and seize back their right to speak. There was that great African-American athlete, singer, he was everything, Paul Robeson. And I was very angry when I came into the Milwaukee airport and they had a poster of great African Americans. They didn't have Paul Robeson and they didn't have W.E.B. Du Bois on it. And I said, I'm not coming back to this airport. In any case, He used to sing the song, The House I Live In. What is America to me? And then he has the famous line, the right to speak my mind out. That's America to me. The right to speak my mind out. If it makes you uncomfortable, walk away. If it makes you feel unwanted, go among a crowd where you feel wanted. And if it makes you feel unsafe, fine, you can call the police. But the police can't arrest you for speaking your mind out. We should seize back those rights, those values, and hopefully turn the tide.
Thank you. So before I hand it off to Aya, I just want to mention that the gentleman who asked you that question right over there, he actually was the one who exercised his right to freedom of expression when Kamala Harris was here, and we successfully drove her out. So thank you for asking that question, being here. And you can go ahead.
The only question now is, who is Kamala Harris?
Thank you, Dr. Finkelstein. As we come to today's end for the event, I want to thank each one of you for being here, for listening, and for engaging in this vital conversation. Thank you, Dr. Finkelstein, for your time and for your words. The struggle for free speech and the struggle for Palestine are deeply connected. The repression of speech, the silencing of the word genocide, and the crackdown of campus activisms are not just random acts. They are calculated efforts to suppress the truth. And if history has taught us anything, it is that movements only win when we refuse to be silent, when we refuse to back down, and when we stand together. Our task now is clear. We must reclaim our right to speak, to assemble, and to resist. This semester, we will fight to win back the free speech that was stolen from us. We will link arms with movements of the past and build a movement strong enough to withstand the repression of today. We will not stop until Zionism, Israeli propaganda, and all of those who support them are completely exposed, not just to those of us in the room, but to every person who walks on this campus and beyond. So let this not be the end of a conversation, but the beginning of a renewed action. I invite each one of you to stay involved, to educate, and most importantly, to never stop speaking the truth. Lastly, I would like to thank all of those who made this event possible. Many student volunteers that you see all around, volunteers from SJP and many other supporting student organizations. Our sponsors, the Islamic Society of Milwaukee, Muslim Women's Coalition, and the Wisconsin Muslim Civic Alliance. Our legal observers from Milwaukee Turners who graciously volunteered their time to make this event happen. And as I mentioned earlier, the event was close to being shut down because of a variety of threats coming from pro-Israeli groups who are scared of Dr. Finkelstein's words. As a result, we requested extra security precautions to be taken. We would like to thank the union staff for helping us out today, including Jessica, Alicia, Mike, and many others. Additionally, we would like to thank the UWM PD who have helped us out today and in previous days and made the safety of this event their priority. For all the groups I mentioned, please thank them on your way out. Dr. Finkelstein has an event at UW-Madison starting in just a few hours. He needs to head out now in order to make it there on time. We appreciate the cooperation in allowing that to happen. It was a pleasure hosting you all at UWM, despite the fact that SJP, along with many other student orgs, are either on probation or at the risk of suspension or currently suspended due to the campus suppression of the Palestinian movement. We refuse to stop working and fighting for a free Palestine. You will continue to hear from us. Thank you.